Thanks to Madupe and Shirley for organizing this event. Thanks to the Bernstein Center for sponsoring not just our research, but all of my colleagues' research as well. It's been a big boost to all of us. And it's wonderful to hear all these different opinions and to hear about what all of my colleagues are doing as well. And so I'll try to do my best and wrap up on a high note as well, given the example that everyone has set for me that has come before. I do want to acknowledge that this is a project that I've started not alone, but with the help of essential collaborators. I think the most important collaborator is Erica Bailey, who's a PhD student in our department in the management division. She's been essential in running a lot of the experiments that I'm going to be showing you, in addition to helping to develop the theory. And so she's been a wonderful collaborator to work on as she has led a lot of the initiative in this project. We're also working with Sarah Soul and Haigriva Rao, who are professors at Stanford at the business school there. And they've been really great in helping us with this project as long and linking us with a tradition of research that I hope to show you in this very brief talk. What I want to start with is simply the observation that the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests of not just 2020, but also 3 years ago and continuing today were historic. And they were historic for a number of reasons, but I want to point out 3 reasons. They were historic because they were large. The crowd counting project, which is housed at a variety of different universities, estimated that there were almost 26 million people who participated in protests just in the 1 week alone in June in 2020. And many more millions have since participated in Black Lives Matter movement protests throughout the summer and the fall. Another characteristic is that they were diverse. And so unlike a lot of protests that attract specific populations of individuals, other researchers have looked at the racial and gender composition of the Black Lives Matter movement protests this past summer and ongoing through the fall. And it just happens to be that they represent a remarkable cross-section of Americans, at least here in the United States and also abroad as well. And I think the other feature of the Black Lives Matter protests that I think are really interesting is that even though the objective of these protests were primarily to call out inequities associated with police brutality and other issues affecting Black Americans and Black people all around the world, what was fascinating is that the targets of protests aren't just state policies and governments, but also business as well. And that's going to become significant in terms of contextualizing this research within why we're doing it here at CBS. But this point is also not that surprising, because based on some past work I've done, what I think is really interesting in terms of observing whom protesters target is that throughout the later 20th century, and this trend continues today, is that the proportion of protests that have targeted the state or the government, that is our elected officials, have gone down over time from about 70% of representative protests in the United States in 1965 to just 50% in 1995. Now, the trend is just the opposite for protests targeting firms or private businesses. And so these numbers go from about 11% of protests in 1965 to almost 30% of protests in 1995. And so combined together with the aspect that protests have been large and diverse, this calls to mind a different type of effectiveness for the protests that we've seen. And what was remarkable about the George Floyd protests in 2020 is that they were also highly effective. And let me show you one piece of evidence why that's true. Just in the short time of that 1 week of protests in June in this past year, the outpouring of support totaled almost $90 million through bail funds. And this is not counting donations to other Black Lives Matter groups as well. And so they were highly effective in mobilizing resources. And so this naturally, I think, leads to the question, well, what makes protest movements effective in general? There's lots of reasons for this, but I'm going to give you one view of this. And that one view suggests that when we perceive movements as deserving, then that leads to their success. Let me be a bit more specific about what I mean. One way to think about a movement as being deserving is to think about whether they're worthy, whether they express unity, whether they are large in terms of numbers, and whether the supporters are committed. That is, it is costly for them to support a movement. Now, this is not my model. This actually comes from a legendary Columbia sociologist and political scientist named Charles Tilly. And this was a model that he spent his entire career working on. What makes a movement deserving? Now, if a movement has these four qualities, worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment, you can think of this as their WUNC-ness or WUNC, as it were, then that leads them to become more successful. So what does success mean? Well, in the context of social movements, movements are successful when they gain attention, when they spread throughout a population, they get more supporters, when they're able to amass more resources, such as donations, and furthermore, when these different aspects then lead them to be able to change policy or some aspect of the society that we all live in. So in order for movements to become successful, they have to first become wonky. So how do we know what makes a movement wonky? Well, this is where our research comes into play. And what we're kind of interested in is the role of diversity in making movements be seen as wonky. And so what does I mean by diversity? Well, on the one hand, you can think of diversity in terms of the demographics of supporters that are seen as being part of a social movement. So you can have a social movement that attracts a very homogeneous type of identity or very diverse individuals along ethnic and racial lines or gender diversity as well. But there's another type of critical diversity as well, and that is in the type of issues that a social movement or a protest espouses. And so, for example, they can be seen as they can be seen as very specialized, championing only a very narrow set of issues, or they can be seen as very broad, incorporating a large number of issues. And so let me give an example of a few of these different categorizations. The Occupy Wall Street movement, for example, from a few years ago, incorporated a number of different issues related to the economy, and they also attracted a diverse set of supporters. The Women's Christian Temperance movement, which predated prohibition in the United States, attracted primarily women of a certain class, and they had one issue, which is to basically ban alcohol or to make it illegal to consume, to purchase alcohol. An example of a movement that attracts a very specific kind of person, but where the issues are very broad, might be the Tea Party movement from a few years ago as well. And finally, a movement that has a very specialized or narrow set of issues, but attracts a large number or diversity of supporters is the Sunrise movement, which is concerned with climate change, which is still ongoing today. And so how do we see which type of movement is seen as more wonky and therefore more successful? Well, we conduct an experiment. And so the experiment basically has the following design. What we do is that we show a group of subjects, different versions of a Facebook page that supports a social movement that we kind of adapted. And so the movement that we chose is about banning animal testing. So this is kind of unethical, what some believe to be unethical animal testing in various different types of corporations. And basically what we did is that in addition to having subjects look at this Facebook page, we also manipulated different elements of this Facebook page. So not everyone got to see the same version of this Facebook page. Some people, for example, would see among the supporters of this movement, a group of people that are very homogeneous in terms of identities, and then others would see a group of people that were very diverse in terms of their identities. In addition, what we also did is that we manipulated the text of what this movement was about. And so some folks saw text that signaled that this Ban Animal Testing Now group was also willing to acknowledge broader issues in society. And then some folks saw that this Ban Animal Testing group was very much focused on banning animal testing, specialized issues. And so we gathered 361 individuals to participate in this experiment. And after they saw these different versions of Facebook pages, which we randomly kind of gave out to the subjects in this experiment, what we did is that we asked them whether they wanted to donate some bit of the compensation that they would receive from participating in the experiment to the group that they just saw. So this is their own money. This is a real thing. We're not saying, would you donate? We actually asked them, will you actually donate? And then we'll take that money from what we're going to pay you. In addition, we also asked about their intentions. For example, if this were a real Facebook page, would you like the Facebook page? And in addition, how likely would you be to write to your elected official in support of the movement? So this is an external type of measure of success. Here were our results. And so when we compared different movements that were, let's say, broad in terms of the issues, as well as diverse in terms of supporters, that were broad in terms of issues, were homogeneous in terms of supporters, and specialized in terms of issues, and homogeneous in terms of identity, we saw that there was some movement on each one of these measures of success. But really, the type of movement that was most able to garner action from the subjects that we tested were those types of movements that which we showed a diverse array of supporters, as well as focused on the narrow issue of banning animal testing. And so what we ultimately found basically was that this combination of having a diverse demographic of supporters, as well as a focused message, is ultimately what was most effective for this social movement and protest movement in terms of garnering support from bystanders or others who might not have otherwise been exposed to the movement. So the takeaway of this research, I think we can kind of bring back to this issue of Black Lives Matter. You know, back in 2017, 2018, there was a lot of press on Black Lives Matter, but in terms of public opinion, it actually didn't have a great deal of support. But we fast forward to this summer, and all of a sudden, there's a vast array of support coming from all different parts of the country for Black Lives Matter. So what's changed? And one kind of hypothesis for this is that the kinds of support for Black Lives Matter has become much more diverse, and opinion has shifted with regard to that perceived change. And I think the lesson from this research is really that big tents are effective, but they're conditional on whether those big tents also have focused interests. And I think the other implication of this research is that we think of protests as being out on the streets. It's what makes the news. It's what's photographed by newspapers. But in reality, the underpinnings of what makes social protests successful today are in many cases their social media strategies. We know that social media is important for organizing protests, but I think what's also crucial for them is to think about how social media can also amass resources for them as well. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Happy to answer any other questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Wang. We are just about out of time, but there was one comment that came into the chat box, and it just says, to WUNC, would you not add having a highly disruptive health event that starts in early spring with unemployment at 30 million, et cetera? Not being cynical, but just think that the choice to protest is among alternatives such as working or going to a restaurant.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't propose that I have an explanation that universally explains the difference between public support in 2017 for Black Lives Matter and 2020 for Black Lives Matter, which is why we actually decided to choose a type of social movement issue prior to the pandemic, is when we actually started this research that was we tested and figured out was not really ideologically aligned with one side or the other. But I fully agree with you that there are so many other factors that explain why people protest or don't protest. We're just talking about one of them here.